A brief history of sugar. It's nearly consumed every day by most of us. We know it's less than good for us, but have you ever thought of the history behind this extremely common spice? It is believed that sometime around 8,000 years before Christ, the first probable domestication of sugarcane by the indigenous people of New Guinea occurred. These original sugar consumers actually ate sugarcane raw. Most likely seaborne traders spread news of this incredible plant. Slowly it moved across Southeast Asia, southern China, until it reached India, which was home of the first organized sugar production. Although Indians preferred honey as a sweetener, they discovered how to turn sugarcane juice into granulated crystals. Now around the year 600, Cyprus and Sicily became important centers for sugar production. Throughout the Middle Ages, it was considered a rare and expensive spice, rather than an everyday condiment. The spread of sugar through the Middle East eventually reached European countries. Then during the 13th century, Cyprus and Sicily became important centers for sugar production. Throughout the Middle Ages, it was considered a rare and expensive spice, rather than an everyday condiment. Now in about the year 1450, the first place to cultivate sugarcane for large-scale refinement and trade was the Atlantic island of Madeira. The Portuguese realized that new and ideal conditions for sugar plantations existed in Brazil. This is where the slave-based plantation economy was established. Sugar was something that nobody needed, but everyone craved. There was a huge demand for labor to cultivate the vast sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Then in 1501, the first African slaves were sent to Brazil and throughout the Caribbean. By the year 1540, there were already about 2,800 sugarcane mills established in the region. This demand for labor led to the transatlantic slave trade. From the year 1501 to about the year 1867, there were an estimated 13 million human beings shipped from Africa to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. The journey from Africa to the Americas was brutal and nearly unbearable for the slaves. It is believed that mortality rates were as high as 25%, and it's estimated that 1 to 2 million dead must have been thrown overboard. In order to purchase slaves from the African elites, goods such as copper and brass, rum, cloth, tobacco and guns were needed. These were secured through the expansion of industrial production, particularly in the English Midlands and Southwest. Modern-day banking and insurance can be traced back to this 18th-century Atlantic economy. The huge number of slaves drove sugar production throughout the Caribbean. The massively profitable sugar business in Barbados, Saint Dominique and Jamaica provided great wealth to the British Empire. Also, the expanding sugar industry led to the explosion of other commodity markets such as rum, molasses, and falernum. In Saint Dominique, which is modern-day Haiti, many large-scale infrastructure projects took place. Irrigation systems were built, reservoirs, diversion dams, levees, aqueducts, and canals. Finally in 1807, Thomas Jefferson signs a bill that prohibits importing slaves to the U.S. Shortly after, the British passed an act for the abolition of the slave trade. But slavery remains widespread. After slavery, sugar plantations used a variety of forms of labor including workers imported from colonial India, and southern China, working as indentured servants on European-owned plantations. Now moving ahead to 1801, in the history of sugar, a scientist named Franz Calicard discovered how to extract sugar from beets on a commercial level. The beet sugar industry thrives in Europe. This eventually enabled Europe to produce sugar in great quantities which made it cheap and available to many people. And by 1880, sugar beet replaced sugar cane as the main source of sugar in Europe. In order to control the supply and the prices of sugar in America, in 1887, leaders of the American sugar industry formed the American Sugar Refining Company, ASRC. This basically monopolized and fixed prices of sugar. And by 1900 the ASRC forms the Domino sugar brand. By 1907, The ASRC controls an unbelievable 97% of all American sugar production. In 1906, C&H Sugar Company is formed by a German immigrant who ran a beet sugar factory in California. C&H stands for California and Hawaii. He dominated sugar production in Hawaii until the 1930s, when sugar plantations were converted for other uses. By 1942, doctors began issuing warnings about the health risks of consuming too much sugar. The American Medical Association's Council on Food and Nutrition suggests that it would be in the interest of the public health for all practical means to be taken to limit consumption of sugar. Then, in 1966, medical professionals recommend a decrease in sugar intake, noting studies that correlate sugar consumption with diabetes and other diseases. And in 1980, the FDA considers fat far worse than sugar. This led to a rise in reduced fat, but high in sugar, processed foods. With increased warnings related to sugar consumption, this led to a rise in the artificial sweetener industry. In 1952, calcium cyclamate starts appearing in diet sodas, but was eventually banned in 1970 after it was found to be carcinogenic. In 1965, aspartame, what was known as the brand Equal, was widely used in diet sodas. Then, in 1967, high fructose syrup corn is developed. In 1977, the United States raised sugar import taxes significantly. During this time, the United States has a massive surplus of corn, so investment was made and several plants were built to convert the surplus of corn into high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is used to sweeten soda, and many other foods such as candies, cookies, pizza sauce, gum, and many other food items.